Welcome to the HR on the Offensive podcast, brought to you by Lace Partners. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to the latest HR on the Offensive podcast. It's me, Chris Howard, as always, joining you on this fabulous Thursday that we release for our latest edition of our pod. Today's podcast is an interesting one. We have recently, at the time of recording, come to the end of our campaign, which was focused around the employee experience revolution. If you want to find out, I won't go into the detail of that because we've done a few podcasts where we've framed it. But if you want to have a little look at that, it's lacepartners.co.uk/EX revolution. As I said, we've been running this campaign for a while, and we've been asking and challenging leaders to think a little bit more holistically around employee experience. We've talked about the different types of employee experience in terms of the different models that we've got, but we also started to think at Lace Towers. We started to think about specifically around the types of experience that individuals have at their different sort of career stages. And so that's going to be that's a little sort of teaser as to what we're going to talk about today. Before I'm going to introduce our special guest, who is an Amazon best-selling author, I need a co-host, and I can't do this without a co-host. And today's co-host, back as always, is Kathy Akratopoulos from Lace. Kathy, you all right?
I'm good, Chris. Lovely to be back. Looking forward to this one. It's very intriguing.
Yes, very intriguing. And the reason why it's very intriguing is because our special guest, as I said, is an Amazon award-winning best-selling author. It's Dr. Lucy Ryan. She is the founding director of Mindspring Consulting, and she's also been a senior lecturer in positive leadership. She's the author of 2 best-selling books, one of which is Lunchtime Learning for Leaders, but the one that we're going to focus in on today, and particularly reference it in relation to experience and employee experience, is her book, which is Revolting Women: Why Midlife Women Walk Out and What to Do About It. Lucy, how are you?
Yes, I'm very well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me, both Chris and Kathy.
No, it's absolutely delightful to have you on. I obviously just gave a little bit of a background in terms of job titles and books that you've written, but just for our listeners, before we get into what is now becoming our traditional fundamentally different question, kick off today, can you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I've run a kind of leadership training and coaching company for the last 20 years and wear a number of different hats these days. So from trainer to coach to author to lecturer, it depends what day of the week it is, as depending what hat I'm wearing. And as the conversation we had before we started, I'm also a dog lover, a very bad yogi, and an outdoor swimmer.
Wow, outdoor swimming. Interesting on that. I'm not sure that one's quite for me. A little bit too cold for the old outdoor swimming. Right, fundamentally different question time. So this is our kickoff one. And if you're listening to this podcast for the first time, we like to ask a fundamentally different question because we are a fundamentally different HR consultancy. So I'm going to start off with you, Lucy, and then I'm going to get Kathy to answer. And then I might answer as well, depending on timing. But I saw something today which talked about, it was a BBC News article talking about a train journey in Scotland that's been described as the Baltic Polar Express because it's so cold on this particular train that people have to take sleeping bags for their journey. So Lucy, the fundamentally different question today for you is, you're on a train journey. What is the one thing you simply could not do without? Is it a sleeping bag or is it something else?
No, it's peanut butter. And I was able to tell you that really easily because many years ago did the Trans-Siberian. And before it was a kind of cool trip that ran well. This was kind of more black market. It was just when the area had opened up again to tourists. And it took 7 days. And we were warned that it would run out of everything by day 3. So what would you take? And you couldn't really take much. So we took 2 jars of peanut butter and 1 bottle of vodka.
The vodka being quite essential, I'm sure.
And all 3 of those things were finished.
Kathy, can you beat that?
I was going to go snacks, so I can't do snacks anymore.
Yeah,
so
you can do snacks.
No, because the other thing that I was torn between was snacks and a really good book. Because to me, a train journey rather than commuting in and out of the city, which, 20-minute train journey, you can't get much done. If I'm on a long train journey, like going down to see my family in Cornwall or something, then I love a good book. And it feels like an absolute luxury to know that you're sitting on a train for 3 or 4 hours. And yes, you might have a bit of work to do and whatever else, but if it's the weekend or whatever, and you've got the time to sit down and know that you're going to sit there with a nice cup of coffee and read a good book, it makes the whole journey feel like complete luxury.
Yeah, absolutely love that. And that almost feels like the most perfectly planted segue to talking about Lucy's book, actually. So,
Exactly.
Listener, honestly, we didn't pre-record this. We didn't pre-rehearse this. So, Lucy, what I'm going to do is, if you can tell our listeners, just give them maybe a couple of minutes on the book itself, why you wrote it, and some of the key features of the book. And then I'll let Kathy kick off with the first question, linking it obviously with the experience side.
Okay, so the book's called Revolting Women, Why Midlife Women Are Walking Out and What to Do About It. It was published about 5 months ago now, and it's based on my PhD. So my PhD was looking at the experience of professional middle-aged women aged between approximately 45 and 65, which is really how people judge midlife, even though it's now getting younger and older. So people are now saying midlife is 35 to 75. So it's soon going to be our lifespan is midlife. But classically, it's kind of 45 to 65 scientifically. And what struck me hugely, and why one of the reasons I wrote the book, I was also coaching a lot of women of this age group. And what struck me is, here are women who have spent their entire careers going through hurdles. So they've got through the maternity hurdle if they had children, they've returned to work, they've got through a lot of the issues of equality at work, and then just at the point of reaching a career peak, they were leaving. And so I was really curious as to why this was happening. I looked round to find out a lot of scientific work, the evidence, and there was almost nothing there. I think in total I found 3 academic papers. So that was one of the reasons I was studying it. And it was hard enough to actually get a supervisor because they said it was uninteresting and unpublishable. And then I really still wanted to turn it into the book. So the book essentially is distilling it down as to why midlife women are leaving organisations and some ideas for what organisations can do to retain them.
And Lucy, we like to be data-led in LACE and in all that we do. So I know that you looked at some data points and you interviewed, I think, 40 or so professional women in that sort of bracket. But what are the couple of stats that you would pick out as being particularly sort of startling or shocking? Because there are some really shocking numbers in this, right?
There are some shocking numbers. I mean, I'll start with some that were not from my research, but are data-led, in that the 2-for-1 stat, Kathy, is one of the easiest ones to start from, in that what we know globally is that for every female director promoted, 2 are exiting the workplace, which is an incredibly major problem. In the UK, we have got, people are saying there's no problem, essentially, because we've got approximately 40% and nudging on to 50% now of our boards are gender equal. What is less understood is that most of the women on boards are non-executive directors. Mm-hmm. And the actual statistic of women who are employed female executives has been static between 11 and 14% for 9 years. So that was kind of my first starting point, was that data. A third of the women I interviewed were exiting the workplace, which was quite a startling statistic. And, 50% of them were in a state of flux. So this was not an easy place for most of the women I interviewed to be.
It's really intriguing, right, Lucy? And that piece around, and we do see headlines about how progress is being made and director level women are increasing, and boards, obviously, as part of their ESG agenda and the DE&I stats are reporting on this. It would be really helpful if maybe that distinction is made more publicly or through those statistics, that how many of these people are NEDs versus how many people are actually full-time members of an executive team.
Right.
And I think the fact that that hasn't changed for 9 years or so, as you're saying, is in itself startling to me.
Yes.
And as someone who is in that age bracket, who feels that she, from my point of view, I've got more to give than I ever used to have. The experience I've gleaned, the life experience, the work experience. Chris has to put up with me in helping to lead lace all the time. But, you know, from my point of view, I'm still learning every day, but I feel like I have a lot of value to add in an organisation at a senior level. And I'm sure a lot of women feel the same. But I was really intrigued by some of the sort of sound bites that I was reading, even just in the early parts of your book, around perceptions as to why people aren't, or why professional women are maybe not in those roles, and maybe the male perception of people as to why they're not in those roles. And one quote I loved it because of its simplicity, but also it's quite scary, was that sort of middle-aged women are either too mad, bad, or sad to take on senior leadership roles, right? Which I found, it leans to so many reasons that I could understand why people think either I personally am not, it's not right for me, or a perception that I may not be the right person for the job. Do you know what I mean? And it just love to explore that a little bit, because that is a perception, right?
It is a perception. And I think one of the most startling things that came out of this, I mean, Mad, Bad and Sad was a very good evidence-based book that was written about women some time ago, was where that soundbite came from. But when you look at the Hampton Alexander report that came out, where they did some interesting interviews with men on senior leadership teams, going, why do you think there's an issue? And the reasons that men gave for women not being promoted were so steeped in mythology and assumptions, it was quite startling. Like, they don't want it, they're not up to it. I think my favourite was, we've already got one, thanks, so we're done. All the good ones have been snapped up. I can't just appoint a woman because I want to. Women don't want the hassle or the pressure. My other board colleagues wouldn't want to appoint a woman. So, this was only kind of 4 years ago.
Yep. And it's scary, right?
You could start to see why this was so static. So I think there is quite a lot of, if I was being hard-hitting, I would say a lot of lip service is paid to this area, which is why we have statistics that are so flatlined.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's just really intriguing. And I guess clearly we're an HR transformation consultancy, so we come at this from a perspective of the employer and the chief people officer, and how you can look at making a change, I guess, or making a difference. But just understanding what's driving those statistics, and therefore why women are leaving businesses, before we come on to what businesses can do to maybe address that. What sort of findings do you have around that? The rationale as to why someone would take themselves out of a role, or take themselves out of a running, or just leave a business at that stage in life, I guess.
I can distill it down relatively simply to 3 areas as to why midlife women are leaving. The first is what we can call is gendered ageism, i.e. where ageism meets sexism. And we know that a lot of older employees at every level are facing ageism. And there has been a drive to kind of get over 50s back into the workplace, hasn't there?
Yep.
But that's usually at junior levels. It hasn't happened at senior levels because it's mainly males still. So ageism, gendered ageism, where ageism meets sexism, what was happening to women just as they were nudging up into really senior posts, I mean, CEO -2, C-suite -2, is they were facing that the noise against them was getting much louder. What they were finding is things like they were excluded from important meetings. They were, projects that they were leading were suddenly going elsewhere. They were called all sorts of language. They were called fuddy-duddies, they were called hags, they were called bints. All sorts of extraordinary language was being labelled at them. But most of all, it was a sense of isolation suddenly, rather than, right, let's promote you upwards. And part of that gendered ageism was also a lack of career paths, a lack of creativity, which I think actually is not necessarily gendered. I think that goes across a lot of older people. But here you had all these women kind of over 50, ready to do something really interesting, and being told, well, you were head of people, now you can be chief people, now you can stay in that. And they're going, but I could do so much more, and I'm interested in so much more. And that just wasn't available. So that was the first reason, was that kind of all-encompassing gendered ageism. The second reason that's been very powerful and recognised by a lot of women is what I've called a midlife collision, which is a unique series of events can often happen to women at midlife. And I'm talking about a combination of menopause with parental care, often with our older children with mental health difficulties, sometimes with divorce, bereavement, financial issues, but usually those kind of big chunky issues of care, menopause, health collide at midlife. Now, what I found really both fascinating and awful was that a lot of these women were just asking for a bit of time out. Sometimes one woman lost both her parents in 5 weeks, and she just wanted time to breathe, to pause. She wanted to press pause, and she wasn't given. She was given a week off, and she needed more time, but not a lot of time. So a lot of the things that are going on are temporary for women at midlife. And then what we have is women who are kind of forged in fire and ready to kind of step up with enormous amounts of resilience and wisdom and energy to find they either can't get back in or they can't get promoted up. So the third reason they leave is the revolt, which is they step out and go, well, if you don't want me the way I am and you don't really want to keep me, promote me, give me a creative career path, then I'll do it for myself, which is why we have got a startling number. I think I'm right in saying 72% of new business accounts are opened by women over 50. Amazing. And plus, we haven't talked about older motherhood. You know, more women over 40 are giving birth now to children than women under 18. So we've got a big shift going on here. And so they're revolting against how we define career success and taking their wisdom, their creativity, their confidence elsewhere.
And a lot of those reasons that you list aren't necessarily gender specific, right? So bereavement, health challenges in the family or personal health challenges, parental care, they're not ones you say that's always the woman, all right? Like HRT, obviously, and midlife collision around the menopause and the health impacts and the treatment plan and so on that you need for that. That is obviously female specific, women specific, but actually some of the other things you're listing are equally applicable to men. So what is it is it just when you combine the more female women aspects to that you get this overall collision, if you like?
It is. And I would say that we still have, 92% of women still take the majority of the care load. Yeah. So you're absolutely right that I completely respect that some men take on the load for their parents and health and family and children. They are still in the minority. And what you find is that it is the women who are doing the role, what I call in the book, role overload. Menopause aside, which is clearly female specific, much as the men are supporting it is female specific. The burden of the care role overload is still falling at a very high percentage to women.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think the point you make there around what would make a difference, I guess, to in recognition of the challenges and also in a challenging talent market, right? Yes. Where whilst, we heard today we're in recession, right? But ultimately there is still a challenge for senior talent, expert talent and hot skills. In that environment, the risks that businesses are running around letting go or not enabling people to stay, maybe in that sort of bracket of category of women, professional women in that environment. This is a business risk, right? In terms of how you manage that, and also a missed opportunity in a sense. When you sort of spoken to the women that you interviewed, were there examples of where organisations they'd worked with were doing things to try and combat this that would have actually made a difference? Things that we call out that might be useful for our listeners that could make a difference?
There are a couple of obvious ones, and then there are ones that will make a difference if they were taken more seriously. The first most obvious one, Kathy, is job sharing. So I think of one of the examples that I gave of this extraordinary example of the head of talent and the head of HR, both whom were leaving, had made the decision to leave, both for different collision reasons. One, her mother had heart problems and her daughter had anorexia, and the other had 3 young boys and her father was dying. And they met in the lift and they were both quite emotional about their decision, and they went downstairs and had a cup of coffee together, and over that coffee crafted a job share and went back up in the lift and presented this job share that was luckily accepted, and they became the first women in the global organisation to do a job share. But she was under no illusions that had they not met, talked to each other, understood the system and the kind of systemic issues around job sharing and talent and HR, there was no way that would have happened. It's not as if they were quite aware that had they both gone separately to the CEO, both would have sadly been let go. So job sharing is just really staring everyone in the face for these women. The second thing is midlife check-ins, and I recommend it in the book, and there were a couple of examples where that's been done really well. And that's having good, holistic conversations. I know, you talk about holistic, amazing employee experiences, don't you? And, midlife check-ins is a really simple way of answering that, which is having good, extensive conversations with all your midlife executives about what is going on, what they are facing, what kind of decisions they're going to be making in the near future, and what they want for their careers. And as they pivot into purpose, as so many midlife women do, what do they want next? So I think that's another really simple one. And then, well, it's not so simple, but it's very powerful. And when that's done, that's very powerful. And I think the third thing that some of the women were saying is when the strategic intent is very clear for the attraction, the retention, the promotion. So there are interesting career paths for their midlife women. It's not one linear, static path that ends at 60. There are multiple branches that could happen. That's when it starts to get really interesting.
And we talk about that. That kind of makes me think about a couple of conversations that we've had, Kathy. So we talked to Simon Smith from Aston Martin about feedback and the importance of listening. And so it's probably a question for both of you, actually. So you can decide between you who wants to answer this first. But I just wanted to get some thoughts on this idea that the importance of listening is listening to your people at all levels, but then also the impact that the type of culture that a business has. Because if you have a culture of a business that is very open and willing to embrace the ideas of people and therefore act on those, like the example you gave, Lucy, where the CEO herself says, no, be on your merry way, versus if people feel empowered to come up with these ideas, then you're going to get more innovation and creativity with those ideas as well, right?
You pose two things, listening and culture. I think culture comes first. I don't think listening comes first. I think if you've got a culture that is very clearly signals of positive intent to your midlife executives, then you're going to be way more open to run midlife check-ins and listen to the feedback. But the only other thing is you've got to have a culture that then in turn is able to act on that feedback. So if you've got a woman going, look, I'd like to say, A, I need some more flexibility. B, I'm really bored doing this and I want to kind of branch off. And C, in return, if we talk about give and get, which I know you talk about in terms of employee value proposition, you give and get, you've got then my loyalty, you've got my wisdom, my confidence, my mentoring powers. So you'll get a lot in return. So I think they dovetail, the listening and culture. I think they're interdependent.
Absolutely, Lucy, completely agree. And I think that the bit I would pick up on, I guess, as well, is that this is also about for me, listening, but then, yes, absolutely being able to take action, but also being flexible and innovative and not just doing things the way you've always done them. So actually your example of the job share is a fantastic example. But to your point, they were HR people who met in the lift by chance, and talked about a topic by chance and then instigated some change. But they had the sort of functional capability and knowledge of how that would work in practice. But I think actually having more flexibility around how people can operate and having those check-ins, as you say, but the ability to listen to ideas and then act on them is key for me, and not necessarily being constrained by policy that may or may not support it. Be willing to make those shifts, recognizing that, at the end of the day, as we've talked about in our various sort of content for our campaign around the EX revolution, understanding what's most important to individuals and understanding how the work environment or the work offer, if you like, is delivering on what's most important is so critical. And if that changes over time, not just time in general, but time per individual and stage of life. And I think being conscious that someone's requirements from their employer and what they value most and what they need changes over time is so important, and the ability to listen. So I really like that idea of midlife check-ins, and I guess it would be relevant for men and women in the workplace to have those conversations.
Without a doubt.
But what would be interesting for our HR listeners, who would they feel confident in their organisation would be the person running the check-in, if you see what I mean? Yes. Who would they see as being the most well-positioned, if you like, in terms of their listening ability and ability to react on that, to have that conversation? And how confident would you be that your people managers could do that well? And know what to do with the answers when you ask that question.
Yes, it's certainly not a conversation you would have clumsily.
No, quite.
Or without some thought, because, of course, you're going to have a conversation like this, you have to do something with the answers.
Absolutely, and manage expectations as well.
And not be scared with what you might hear. So... But I think this all comes back to strategic intent, doesn't it? If you've got an organisation or a culture, as you say, Chris, with the strategic intent to take all of this seriously and the attraction, the retention, the promotion of their midlife women seriously, then the rest of it becomes sweeter and easier.
And what's interesting, Lucy, is when we talk about designing experiences for our clients, we typically think about different persona groups. So the employee role type, their location, and we might look at their preferences in terms of their learning style and all different sort of cultural aspects as well. And when we talk about career stage, we tend to focus on young talent, right? When you come into an organisation, you're grad coming in, or you're trying to hire apprentices, or you're trying to deal with those first few years of someone's career. There isn't the same balance of focus on the later years of someone's career. Right. And I find that quite an interesting contrast.
I think it is fascinating when you actually consider that our theories of motivation, we're still applying theories from the 50s, which is that we have a linear career and then at 60 we're in stagnation and we retire. And that does happen for some people still, particularly people who've had a linear career, mainly men. When you've got women who've had zigzag careers, you'll find their motivations completely different. And you'll have women who are talking about being at their career peak at 60. Far from I'm about to kind of leave, they're going, give me more, I'm ready, my kids have left home, there's a freedom to my life now and I'm ready to get going. So I think we really have to rethink some of our workplace assumptions. I recognise I'm asking for something quite big here because I kind of want to rethink the world of work, but one step at a time.
but Lucy, there are so many, just from a purely commercial perspective, there is good business sense in this, right? Let alone the cultural side of it and the ethical side of it and the, the diversity and inclusion side of it. There is good business sense to this.
Yes. I mean, I wrote in the book for kind of HR professionals that let's take the moral out of this. We can all see the moral argument and let's actually put the economic argument in to balance it too. And that's been made very clear time and again, let alone at a time of talent squeeze.
Yeah, absolutely. We are just on time, annoyingly, actually, because I feel like I could have just watched and listened into you two lovely ladies for at least another half an hour, because that was really fascinating stuff. Lucy, we will probably drag you on for another one, because that's been absolutely brilliant. So thank you very much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
And Kathy, fantastic for you co-hosting for me as always. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the discussion, Lucy. It's such an interesting book and topic, and I'm sure a lot of our people are going to be listening are going to be wanting to read more detail, and also our HR listeners are going to be starting to challenge themselves, I think, around what more could they be doing. I think it's raised so many questions. I think it's been incredibly useful. So thank you so much.
Absolutely. So Lucy, where can just for those people listening, and where can they find the book? I'd imagine Amazon, obviously, if you search Revolting Women.
Yeah, you can
Why Midlife.
That's right. Either get it from Amazon or from the publishers Practical Inspiration Publishing, and you can find me on LinkedIn under Dr. Lucy Ryan. Absolutely perfect. As always, been fabulous to have you two lovely people join me. You can, of course, get this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. We're across all of the major platforms, and you can also access all of our podcasts on the Lace Partners website, lacepartners.co.uk/podcast. From myself, from Lucy, and from Kathy, thank you very much for listening, and we will catch you next time on the HR on the Offensive podcast. Bye-bye.